17 days. That is the gap between one of the boldest bets in low-cost aviation history and the moment the region it was built around went to war. On February 11, 2026, Tony Fernandes stood in Manama and told the world that AirAsia was going to build its first hub outside Asia, in Bahrain. $10 billion of investment, 100 aircraft based there eventually, 45 million passengers a year. A low-cost network connecting Southeast Asia to Europe and Africa through a single Gulf stopover. The first Asian budget carrier to seriously crack the transatlantic budget market using a Middle East hub. 17 days later, the Gulf went dark. So here's the question I want to take you through today. Is this plan a stroke of genius that was simply unlucky with its timing? Or does the Gulf crisis reveal something deeper about why this bet is harder than it looks? And what does the full story of how AirAsia got here tell us about where low-cost long-haul aviation is actually heading? Because this story did not start in February 2026. It actually started in a boarding school in England in the 1970s. And the path between that starting point and a $10 billion Gulf hub runs through some of the most turbulent chapters in aviation history. Tony Fernandes, the CEO of AirAsia, grew up partly in England. As a schoolboy at Epsom College in Surrey, his dearest wish during half-term was to fly home to Malaysia to see his family. The flight tickets were prohibitively expensive, and regular visits home were out of the question. What is why? That experience, the gap between wanting to fly and being able to afford to fly, stayed with him. It became the animating idea behind everything he built later. He graduated from the London School of Economics, worked in finance, became a music executive, and then in 2001 did something that most people thought was either brave or foolish. He and a group of partners bought the then bleeding AirAsia from its Malaysian government owner for a token 1 Malaysian ringgit, which was approximately 25 US cents, and agreed to take over the airline's 40 million ringgit debt. The airline started with 2 Boeing 737-300s, 1 destination, and a staff of 250 people. In 2001, estimates indicated that only around 6% of Malaysians had ever been on board a commercial aircraft. Fernandes saw this not as a problem, but as an opportunity of staggering scale. He was not trying to take passengers away from other airlines. He was trying to create passengers who had never existed before. He restructured AirAsia entirely around the idea of targeting people who had never flown, people who had always taken buses or trains or ships, because the plane was for someone else, someone richer. But building cheap flights was only half the battle. The other half was making those flights legal to operate in the first place. In 2003, barely 2 years after buying the airline, Fernandes lobbied Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad to propose open skies agreements with neighboring Thailand, Indonesia, and Singapore. As a result, those nations granted landing rights to AirAsia and other budget carriers. What was once a Singapore Airlines and Malaysia Airlines duopoly on the Kuala Lumpur to Singapore route became one of the world's busiest international air links overnight. Fernandes later said that some days he could not even get a seat on his own airline on that route. The lesson stayed with him for the rest of his career. Building an airline is one thing. Reshaping the regulatory environment that the airline operates in is something else entirely. The Bahrain hub announcement, and specifically the 5th freedom rights that make it commercially viable from day one, is Fernandes doing exactly what he did in 2003, finding a regulatory opening and building a business around it before anyone else moves. But back to where we were. Within 2 years, AirAsia had repaid its entire debt. Within a decade, it had become the largest low-cost carrier in Asia. Skytrax has consistently rated AirAsia as the world's best low-cost carrier, giving it that award for 15 consecutive years. The idea that had started with a homesick schoolboy who could not afford a ticket home had become a network of over 250 aircraft serving over 160 destinations across 25 countries. But the dream that Fernandes had carried since that boarding school in Surrey, the affordable flight between Asia and Europe, remained stubbornly out of reach. In 2007, Fernandes established AirAsia's as a separate long-haul entity, the arm of the group that would finally solve the Europe problem. AirAsia's launched its first international flight in November 2007, connecting Kuala Lumpur to Gold Coast, Australia. Australia worked. The distances were manageable, the demand was there, and the model produced load factors that made the economics viable. Europe was, to say the least, different. In 2009, AirAsia's announced its plans to launch direct flights from London Stansted to Kuala Lumpur. The inaugural flight took off in March 2009 using Airbus A321 aircraft. The airline strategy was to disrupt the long-haul market by offering significantly lower fares without compromising on the essential in-flight experience. The initial response was promising. Budget travelers who had previously had no affordable option between the UK and Southeast Asia booked in large numbers. The fares were genuinely low. The brand was generating excitement. And then, the economics started breaking down. AirAsia's operated from Kuala Lumpur to London between 2008 and 2012 with A340-300s, but yield pressure and higher fuel costs forced it to end European services. The airline appeared to have been unable to find a niche between the Middle East superconnectors, capturing price-sensitive traffic on Malaysia to UK routes on one side, and flag carriers like British Airways, filtering off premium traffic on the other. The problem was structural, not operational. A direct Kuala Lumpur to London flight requires an aircraft large enough to carry sufficient passengers to cover the sector costs, and that aircraft needs to be fueled for 13 hours of flying. The fuel cost alone on that sector, using a 4-engine A340-300 at 2012 fuel prices, made the low-fare model mathematically very difficult. You could not charge enough for the ticket to cover the fuel without pricing yourself out of the budget market. AirAsia's abandoned the route in 2012 and accepted the loss. Fernandes retreated to the medium-haul sweet spot: Japan, South Korea, Australia, China, the corridors where the model worked cleanly. For years, when asked about Europe, his answer was consistent and honest. He said, in 2019, long-haul Europe is just not in our plans. We are pioneers in the long-haul low-cost market, but the reality of the model is medium-haul routes of 6 to 8 hours. That is the sweet spot. Read that statement carefully. The man who dreamed as a schoolboy of an affordable flight between England and Malaysia was telling the world in 2019 that it could not be done, not with the aircraft available, not with the fuel prices of the era, not against the competition that existed. But then something changed. Before I continue, here is something that surprises me every time I check my analytics. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now are not subscribed. 90%. AirAsia just made one of the biggest announcements, and most people have no idea it even happened. That is exactly the kind of story that needs to reach further. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, share this with one person who follows everything on aviation. Now, let's continue. Two things happened between 2019 and 2026 that reopened the door Fernandes had closed. The first was the aircraft. The Airbus A321 XLR, which we have covered on this channel, changed the economics of medium-haul flying fundamentally. It is a narrow-body aircraft, smaller and cheaper to operate than any wide-body, with enough range to fly 7-hour sectors efficiently. The fuel burn per seat on a 7-hour sector in an A321 XLR is meaningfully lower than on the wide-body aircraft that previously dominated long-haul routes. By June 2022, AirAsia confirmed its commitment to receiving A321 XLRs, with deliveries expected to begin in 2026. The second was the geometry. Fernandes had been thinking about the Europe problem not as a single flight, but as 2 flights with a stop in the middle. If an A321 XLR can fly 7 hours efficiently from Kuala Lumpur to a Gulf city, and 7 hours efficiently from a Gulf city to London, then Kuala Lumpur to London becomes 2 medium-haul flights rather than 1 ultra-long-haul flight. 2 sectors where the model works cleanly, joined at a hub in the middle. The question then was which Gulf city? Post-pandemic, Fernandes had said that the London route would eventually be operated with a Dubai stopover. Dubai was the obvious answer, the largest aviation hub in the world, with existing slot availability and passenger flows that would fill the sector easily. But Dubai had problems. The slot environment at Dubai International is competitive and expensive. Emirates dominates it. And the entire Dubai hub model depends on the kind of infrastructure integration that AirAsia, as a new entrant with no existing presence, would take years to build. More fundamentally, Dubai is a hub already optimized for carriers very different from AirAsia. The alignment was not clean. Bahrain offered something different. AirAsia X had actually planned a Bahrain hub as far back as 2009, with plans to serve Frankfurt, Cairo, and possibly East Africa from there, though these never materialized due to the financial difficulties of that era. And ASL, the idea was not new. What was new was the combination of a government in Bahrain actively seeking to develop its aviation sector after Gulf Air's decline reduced its international connectivity, a letter of intent signed in November 2025, and an aircraft, the A321 XLR, that made the two-stop model commercially viable in a way it had never been before. The announcement on February 11, 2026 was the public crystallization of years of strategic evolution. Tony Fernandes announced that Bahrain, as their strategic aviation hub, allows AirAsia to connect Asia with the Middle East and Europe more effectively, while creating a scalable platform for future growth. The first route is confirmed and on sale. On June 26, 2026, AirAsia X will operate a daily service. The flight departs Kuala Lumpur at 10 in the evening, arrives in Bahrain at 12:40 in the morning, continues to London Gatwick at 2:25 in the morning, and arrives in London at 7:25. The return departs Gatwick at 10:25 in the morning, transits Bahrain, and arrives back in Kuala Lumpur at 9:55 the following morning. And ASL, the route will be operated by one of AirAsia's A330s, configured with either 222 or 121 business class style seating. AirAsia sells this as a premium flatbed product, simpler than what you will find in business class on a full service carrier, but with a genuine lie flat bed. The fifth freedom rights embedded in this arrangement deserve attention. Fifth freedom rights allow an airline to carry passengers between two foreign countries as part of a longer international route. AirAsia can sell the Bahrain to London leg as a standalone ticket. A passenger in the United Kingdom who wants to fly to Bahrain does not need to route through Kuala Lumpur. They simply buy a London to Bahrain ticket on AirAsia. The hub is bi-directional from day one, generating traffic from both ends rather than only from Malaysia. The ambition behind this first route is considerably larger. Fernandes has outlined a vision of having many flights a day from Southeast Asia into Bahrain, and from Bahrain building a network to fly to all over Africa and Europe. The long-term goals include basing 100 aircraft in Bahrain, carrying 45 million passengers annually, and connecting to 120 cities over the next decade. Capital A, also known as the former AirAsia Group, have their logistics arm, Teleport, following a $50 million capital raise, begun serving Bahrain with its first flight arriving on the day of the announcement. An MRO facility is being planned, cargo operations are launching. AirAsia is not just opening a route. It is attempting to build an aviation ecosystem, the same model that made the major Gulf carriers so resilient at a budget price point. Passengers funding the hub, cargo filling the belly, maintenance generating third-party revenue, all of them reinforcing each other. This is the architecture that made Emirates into the largest international carrier in the world. Fernandes is trying to build a version of it from the bottom up, with narrow-body aircraft, budget fares, and a fraction of the capital that Emirates had at its disposal. And then came February 28th, 2026. The Gulf went dark. Bahrain appeared on suspended destination lists across dozens of airlines. Iranian missiles and drones struck targets across the region. A hub that had not yet operated its first scheduled commercial flight was already navigating the most serious Gulf crisis in 40 years. This is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, in ways that require honest assessment rather than reassurance. The intuitive reaction is that Fernandes has terrible timing. 17 days between the announcement and the crisis is almost absurdly unfortunate. But the more important question is not about timing. It is about whether the underlying bet remains sound once the crisis passes. Every airline that builds a hub in the Gulf is making a long-term wager. The wager is that the region's extraordinary geographic advantage, its position at the midpoint of the most important long-haul corridors on Earth, will consistently outweigh its geopolitical risk over the life of the investment. Emirates and Qatar Airways collected that wager for 40 years. The first time it was seriously tested, it failed temporarily but comprehensively. AirAsia is about to make the same wager on a smaller scale. The difference is that AirAsia is making it with full knowledge of what just happened in the weeks immediately after the crisis demonstrated the downside risk with brutal clarity. That is either reckless or courageous, depending on how you assess the probability of the crisis resolving into a stable new equilibrium versus a permanent deterioration in Gulf regional security. Fernandes has faced this kind of assessment before. AirAsia launched in the immediate aftermath of September 11, 2001, at a moment when the aviation industry was in free fall and every rational analysis suggested it was the wrong time to start an airline. AirAsia repaid its debt within 2 years. He launched AirAsia X through the 2008 fuel crisis. He rebuilt Capital A through the pandemic when the entire long-haul, low-cost sector was being written off as commercially dead. But not every chapter in the Fernandes story is one of straightforward triumph. And telling this story honestly means including the one that nearly ended everything before the Bahrain announcement was ever conceived. On January 31st, 2020, the UK's Serious Fraud Office approved a record $4 billion settlement with Airbus over allegations of widespread bribery across multiple countries. Buried inside the court documents was an allegation that stopped the aviation world. The SFO alleged that Airbus had paid a bribe of $50 million to secure plane orders from AirAsia. The payments were described as sponsorships of a sports team owned by two unnamed AirAsia executives, referred to in the documents as Executive 1 and Executive 2. The SFO said the two were key decision makers in AirAsia and AirAsia X, and were rewarded in respect of an order for 180 aircraft from Airbus. AirAsia shares fell as much as 11% to their lowest level since 2016. AirAsia X shares fell 12% to an all-time low. The timing could not have been worse. The coronavirus was beginning to spread across Asia. Aviation demand was already weakening, and now the airline's two most senior executives were implicated in one of the largest bribery cases in corporate history. Tony Fernandes and executive chairman Kamarudin Maranun temporarily stepped down from their roles for at least 2 months while an investigation was conducted. Both denied wrongdoing, categorically. In a joint statement, they said they would not harm the very companies that they spent their entire lives building up to their present global status. An independent review, conducted by BDO Governance Advisory, ultimately cleared both executives and reinstated them in their positions. The review found that the two had properly disclosed their interests to AirAsia's board and abstained from discussions and decisions relating to the said sponsorships. What was less cleanly resolved was the broader investigation. Bursa Malaysia, the Malaysian stock exchange, had announced its own investigation into AirAsia. But that investigation came to an abrupt end following intervention by the Securities Commission, which asked Bursa to stand down and cease all communication on the matter. As of early 2022, there had been no word on the outcome of the Securities Commission's own probe, with sources describing the silence ever since as notable. The allegations were never proven in court against Fernandes or AirAsia directly. Airbus settled with prosecutors without any finding of guilt against the airlines it dealt with. The story sits in that uncomfortable space between cleared and fully resolved, which is precisely where allegations of this kind tend to sit when the formal legal process does not produce a definitive verdict either way. What it does tell you is this: the man now announcing a $10 billion Gulf hub is not a simple success story. He is someone who built something extraordinary, faced an allegation that could have ended his career and his airline simultaneously, stepped aside voluntarily, was cleared by an independent review, and continued building. Whether you find that reassuring or complicated probably depends on how much weight you give to the unresolved questions that remain. His entire career has been a series of bets that looked badly timed and turned out to be prescient. Here's what I will be watching in the months ahead, and why I think this matters beyond AirAsia itself. The low-cost, long-haul model has failed repeatedly. In its early years, AirAsia X attempted to build a European network operating to London and Paris, but after suffering heavy losses, was forced to abandon this operation in 2013. It appears to have been unable to find a niche between the Middle East superconnectors capturing price-sensitive traffic on one side and flag carriers filtering off premium traffic on the other. Norwegian tried and failed. WOW Air tried and collapsed. Zoom Airlines tried and went bankrupt. The graveyard of budget long-haul carriers is longer than any other category in aviation. The Bahrain two-stop model is a genuinely different attempt at solving the same problem. Not a faster aircraft, not a cheaper wide-body, but a different network architecture that breaks the problem into pieces each aircraft can solve efficiently. It recognizes what Fernandes himself identified in 2019 as the truth about budget long-haul. The sweet spot is 6 to 8 hours, so build a network where no sector is longer than 7 hours. If the June 26th launch date holds, despite everything that has happened, it will tell you that Fernandes believes the current disruption is genuinely temporary and that the underlying strategy has not changed. If it slips by months rather than weeks, it will tell you that even the most committed aviation entrepreneur has limits to how aggressively he will push into a region still dealing with active conflict. Either way, the story matters for everyone who watches this channel. Because the gap between what a full-service carrier charges for London to Kuala Lumpur and what AirAsia is proposing to charge is measured in hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. If this model works, millions of passengers who currently cannot afford to fly between Asia and Europe will be able to. The democratization of air travel that Fernandes started in Southeast Asia in 2001 will reach across the Gulf into European and African markets that have never had a genuinely affordable long-haul option. That was the dream of a homesick schoolboy in Surrey who could not afford the ticket home. It is now a $10 billion bet placed 17 days before the region went to war. Whether the timing turns out to be catastrophic or irrelevant depends on forces well outside AirAsia's control. What is inside AirAsia's control is the aircraft, the routes, the fares, and the ecosystem being built in Bahrain around the hub. I will be watching. And if you want to be watching with me when it happens, the subscribe button is right below this video. The next chapter of this story is coming faster than anyone expected. You should be here when it does. All of those things are real. All of them are ready. The only question is whether the world around them stabilizes quickly enough for the June 26th departure to take off on schedule. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are on this topic. If you enjoyed this video and want to actually understand how aircraft work beyond surface level explanations, there's a great resource I recommend. It's called Flight Unveiled. It's a complete bundle that covers both pilot knowledge and aircraft engineering, from aerodynamics and systems to flight instruments, navigation, and real-world operations. Instead of piecing information together from different videos, it gives you a structured, deeper understanding of aviation in one place. You can click the link that appears now in the right upper corner or in the description below.